Family systems theory allows us to apply the ideas from ecological and developmental theory to a particular social system. So using Bronfenbrenner's social systems theory, we understand families as multi-generational microsystems. And you'll remember from systems theory, a microsystem is any social system in which there is face-to-face interaction between the individuals involved. This is an important context for human development. Now we get to apply some specific concepts from Bronfenbrenner's theory to families. So for example, Bronfenbrenner said that a key principle of social systems is synergy, meaning that the whole system is greater than the sum of its parts. The people in the system have their own characteristics and identities, but the system itself is more than just those people. It has an identity of its own. The system has subsystems, dyads and triads, perhaps parents and siblings, relationships between individual parents and children. And changes in any one part of the system have ripple effects throughout. Another major idea from Bronfenbrenner's social systems theory is that boundaries determine who's in and who's out of a social system and give the system its identity. These boundaries are drawn by the people in the system. In family theory, enmeshed families have very tight or rigid boundaries. Moving in or out of one of these families is not easy. So these families are reluctant to let go of adult children, and they're reluctant to accept in-laws or others into the system. In contrast, disengaged families are thought to have very loose or unclear boundaries. So it's not always clear who's in and out of the family. It's loose, people can come and go, and the sense of identity is a little opaque. These concepts of enmeshed and disengaged are really two ends of a continuum with clear, permeable boundaries in the middle. So most families have fairly clear boundaries about who's in and out. That can change over time with divorce, death, birth, marriage, other unions. And permeable boundaries are useful because they allow for information as well as individuals to come in and out. Family systems are unlike other microsystems in some ways, in that some family relationships are not voluntary. We cannot choose our parents, and we don't often choose our children. And families have unique functions that we'll talk about more in a bit. But families are like other microsystems in some ways, in that they accomplish functions through division of labor and a creation of roles. All microsystems do this. Families have particular communication patterns, ways of communicating within and outside of the system. And like all microsystems and all social systems, families tend to maintain homeostasis. They resist change and tend to maintain the status quo. Now this is because it takes quite a bit of effort to develop a system, a social system, to define roles, divide labor, develop communication patterns, develop problem-solving approaches. And once that's done, once a system is in motion, it's easiest to stay the same. And we'll see this homeostasis is always threatened by changes in any individual, both normative and non-normative changes. Family theory is really a theory of diversity. There's no single model of family health. So we're not saying that some families are healthy or unhealthy. We can talk about effective family processes, such as problem solving. We focus on caring and committed relationships. And there are certain important issues in family theory. These include belief systems or narratives, the stories that families tell about themselves. What kind of a family are they? Where do they come from? What are they like? How do they describe their own stories to insiders and outsiders? What meanings do they make of adversity, of shared challenges? How do they normalize and contextualize or problematize distress? Do they have positive or negative or neutral outlooks on life, on family? What kinds of organizational patterns do families have? How flexible are these patterns? How connected are they? How do they build and use social and economic resources. And a third set of important issues for families has to do with communication and problem solving. How do families do this? Is there clarity, openness, collaboration? Is problem solving a joint, shared venture? Is it effective? So we can discuss family functioning in these terms, again, without having to label processes as healthy or unhealthy. Family resilience, according to Walsh, is the ability to withstand and rebound from disruptive life challenges. Dynamic processes lead to positive adaptation to stress and adversity. That's what makes for resilience. So it's important to think of the family as a source of resilience, that this is a relational context for individual resilience. We know that the presence of many risk factors doesn't necessarily lead to disorders or negative outcomes. For example, most abused children did not become abusive parents. Werner and Smith found that supportive adults are very important in determining whether or not a young person becomes resilient. So the support of kin or mentors or any caring adult can be instrumental in helping youth overcome adversity. So instead of thinking of people as being damaged by adversity, we think of this as a challenge for individuals and families. Adversity is a potential for growth and for transformation. And in truth, people who have weathered adversity often develop strengths that others who didn't have those experiences do not have. So adversity breeds strength and resilience. Stress and coping is an important theme here. In many cases, we see the pileup of stressors on individuals and families, and this is often created by complex and changing conditions such as divorce or death, major life transitions. No single coping response is most effective for any individual or family. Different strategies are needed to cope with challenging circumstances. In challenging circumstances, we often rely on legacies of the past, influence of past experience with life cycle changes. Family systems are related in many ways to attachment and attachment styles. So when we talk about enmeshed dyads or pairs, particularly partners, we often see some insecure attachments marked by distress and intrusive or controlling behavior on the part of one or both people. This often is a mark of anxious ambivalent attachment style in childhood, which becomes preoccupied in adulthood. There's a pursuer-distancer cycle of marital conflict that's often observed, where you have partners that have preoccupied attachment styles and one partner who has a dismissive attachment style. So one is pursuing or preoccupied with the other, and the dismissive person is distancing him or herself from the partner. So we have patterns of approach and avoidance that lead to conflict in marital or other relationships. These views of attachment in family relationships are very Western. In the West, enmeshed ties are seen as intrusive, interfering with individuality and development, and controlling. These same patterns are seen as adaptive in other cultures, in particular in Japan, where symbiotic relationships are seen as indicative of sensitive care. In Japan and other Eastern cultures, there's an emphasis on skinship, closeness, interdependence. And skinship has become an important idea in the West in recent years as well. So secure attachment, the way we understand it through Marjorie Main's work with adults and Mary Ainsworth's work with children, secure attachment is a basis for independence in the West, and it's a basis for interdependence, or amai, in Japan. In Japan, there's this idea of, I can't say it properly, a taikan, which means an extremely close relationship, an absence of boundary between the individuals. That's a sign of maturity in Japan, and it's a sign of enmeshed ties in the West. There are, however, generational differences in these patterns. We're seeing both continuity and change in patterns of relationships in the West and in the East. We're seeing changes in attachment styles and separation and individuation over time. The family life cycle, developed by Carter and McGoldrick, builds on Erikson's theory of stages of development of individuals, and it looks at the cogwheeling of generations. So looking at the developmental tasks faced by each individual in a family, we can think about how those tasks mesh or align. And then think about the family as a whole as falling into a stage. Carter and McGoldrick identified the family life cycle stages as leaving home, beginning with the exit of one adult child or adolescent child, and then the joining of families when that child forms a partnership. The family with young children is a different stage requiring different kinds of communication patterns, different kinds of roles and tasks. The family with adolescents, yet another stage because the family's tasks change as children grow. And then there's launching or leaving home for the young person and midlife for the older generation, followed by late middle age and nearing the end of life. Now, as with all stage theories, there are some problems with this one in that families really can be in more than one stage at a time. A family can have both young children and adolescents, or it can have adolescents and young adults who are leaving home. So if that's the case, if a family can be in more than one stage at a time, you don't really have a discrete stage theory. Another problem here is that you see that the focus really is primarily on one generation. A second generation is acknowledged and sort of worked in here, but what about families that have 3 or 4 generations that are interacting at any given point in time? This life cycle theory doesn't really talk about them. So here are some strengths of the life cycle approach to families. It's important to view families as developmental themselves. Families themselves have developmental challenges influenced by the developmental stage of each individual in the system, and those challenges change over time. And as I've said before, the family is an important context for the development of individuals, and it's an important social system in its own right. But the life cycle stages don't always fit families. This cogwheeling of the generations, as I've said, only deals with 2 generations. It also assumes that families have children, and that's often not the case. And so how do we describe the development of a family without children? This theory doesn't say anything about that. And again, it doesn't deal with families who have children in multiple stages. If a family can be in multiple stages at once, then of course the stage theory doesn't really hold up. Also, this theory doesn't deal with the formation of step or blended families, which is a very important issue nowadays and requires an enormous amount of effort on the part of people involved. So how do we use family systems theory in social work? Eco-maps, which show the systems in which an individual and family are involved in, are very common tools used in social work. I suspect that you've already used them in your foundation practice classes if you're in those classes. So the eco-map starts from the perspective of an individual or a family and draws out relationships with the other micro, meso, exo, and macro systems involved. We also use genograms that show ancestral lines. And we use family timelines or history, looking at what are the major events in the life of this family. What has happened? In clinical contexts, families are usually seen in terms of crisis or stress. That's a really important thing to keep in mind. So we have to balance the current situation with information on family strengths and previous adaptations to adversity. Families are not coming into clinical context at their best, and we need to find out what their best is. How have they coped before? How has this family functioned in larger social, economic, and cultural contexts and over time? And we ask, what are the normative or normal, expected developmental stressors and non-normative, unexpected stressors in the life of the family? That's all for now. Talk to you soon.